I'll loan you my mic.
Thank you for the film. And my question is about the smugglers. If you had mentioned that there's sort of this bureaucracy and there's this whole system. And I wanted to pose a question to you who've had so much experience for so many years with a variation of different populations of refugees. Could you explain to us a little bit more about this culture of smuggling? Because it's sort of a dirty word, right? But I don't know how dirty that word really is. And do they travel with the refugees to their destination and remain there? Or do they go back and make some more money? Could you explain that culture? And also, are they sort of helping with this technology? I mean, everyone seems to have more gadgets than me, and I don't know how do they pay? I mean, I'm a social worker, so I'm dealing with a lot of people who have this Obama phone, they call it. How are they getting access to the internet like this on these boats and everywhere? So.
There's an international definition of smuggling as an international crime, as well as a separate and different international definition of trafficking. So I think it's important to make the distinction between the two. A smuggler is a person who you pay to get you across illegally, irregularly across a border. So it's really a crime against the state. It's not by itself a human rights violation. It's essentially a private contract to break the law, a state law, state sovereignty by crossing a border. So per se, smuggling would not be of particular interest to Human Rights Watch, for example. It would be to law enforcement, legitimately so. However, trafficking, by definition, is exploitation. It's coercion, deceit. It could be sex trafficking, forced labor, holding people for ransom. And one of the difficulties is the slippery slope between the two. And I've seen it myself, particularly the route that goes through the Sahara Desert, which this group of people specifically took a boat in order to avoid, because I'm sure they were aware of the reports of what happens through the Sahara, which is extremely dangerous, where people are held for ransom. Phones are, speaking of the technology, phones put up to their mouths. They have the names on the phones of their family members, and they are tortured while they demand higher amounts of money from their family members. And the traffickers, in this case, maybe they were sold, initially they started out as smuggling, but then it can transform into a trafficking operation. But there are smugglers, and there are people, and you mentioned it, George. The people that actually are on the boats oftentimes are the people that can't afford to pay the smuggler, and so they're working. They're sort of singing for their supper, so to speak. And so there are guys that had never been on a boat in their life that were piloting these boats, across the Aegean or the Mediterranean. And when they were being stopped, in one case I know very well, one that I interviewed, a 27-year-old Syrian guy. He was piloting the boat. He'd never been on a boat before in his life. And this was in the Aegean Sea, and the masked men, came that are probably off-duty Coast Guard people, and beat him up. And I've got pictures on my phone. You can just see his face just, completely beaten to a pulp, because they, identified him as the smuggler. And I do think we need to be careful that in most of the cases in the Mediterranean, and most of the cases in the Aegean, these are people who did pay some, large amounts of money. We've seen it's very profitable. It is against the law, but for the most part, this is not trafficking. And I think the narrative coming from governments that this is anti-trafficking and this is, we're doing this for this sort of humanitarian reason. Let's be honest. The main reason is to stop the migration flow. And it's done in the name of anti-trafficking, in the name of anti-smuggling. But they really just want people to stop reaching the shores of Europe.
Thank you.
And I don't know if George, either one of you could, but maybe George can comment on the gadgets, because this has come up before, like how people have phones and they have all these things, and how does that all work?
But just to add to what Bill said, is that quite often when you talk about smuggling people, it's not possible to kind of run an operation of this sort without people, without the government being involved. We talk about corruption or paying the smugglers in terms of how much money they earn. But on the other side is like the EU-Turkey deal. You know, like money passes hands, hoping that you stop people on the other side. It's the same thing with Egypt at the time. That, hey, why aren't you policing your borders there? So which is why Afaf and Mustafa are arrested. You know, so the whole point is like, so what the Egyptians do is fill their jails with people, hold them for a minimum 15 days. So when EU authorities are coming and saying, hey, well, how are you policing your border? They say like, look at our jail. They're filled with people. What do you expect us to do? You know, and so this again goes into the corruption and like people who can pay, who can get out, who can then pay for the boats, etc. Again, about the smartphones. You know, the thing is like most Syrians, Syria as a country is like, we know it more as, say, you know, as an authoritarian state. But as much as it was an authoritarian state, it invested a lot in education over the decades. So what you have is a population that's very well educated, very well connected, and smartphones have very much been part of their lives. Like Europeans are surprised as well. It's like sometimes European politicians talk about it. Say, why do you think they don't need our help? Look at them; they all have smartphones. And this actually plays into another stereotype that we all have, because we think the kind of needy refugee is someone from Africa with a distended belly, starving, and that's the kind of image that we think is deserving of help. But someone who has a smartphone, who knows what they're doing, is suddenly like, hey, it doesn't fit our image of who's a refugee. But then quite often these are people who had great lives, like Bill was saying. You know, but then bombs are raining on their cities, on their houses, and they just as much as in need of a safe place to live.
Thank you.